Just before the birds started chirping, a baker cheerfully whistled to himself while unlocking his shop's front door. The morning air was refreshingly cool, but that was only because it was still early. Nowadays, it wasn't unusual for January temperatures to reach the high 70s. It felt odd, the baker thought, but he had never been fond of shoveling snow anyway. Today, instead of snow, he was scooping flour into large mixing bowls. His first task was to prepare the bread, followed by whipping up some scones. Scones were his specialty, and he had a wide variety of flavors to satisfy eager customers. There were blueberry, lemon poppy seed, pumpkin, chocolate chip, and morning glory options. For those who preferred savory treats, he offered thyme with goat cheese, sun-dried tomato, and bacon cheddar chive. He set aside one batch just for himself, cranberry orange zest drizzled with a sweet glaze today. These scones would be extra special, featuring an additional scoop of cranberries and a sprinkle of whimsical toppings for flair. The thought made the baker's mouth water in anticipation. While waiting for the oven, he savored some black coffee, which filled the bakery with the delightful scent of freshly baked bread. Even after all these years, he couldn't resist the temptation of warm bread, and his waistline was a testament to that. Leaning against the counter, the baker took a break to enjoy his breakfast and scroll through his phone. He stumbled upon an alarming political meme shared by an overly dramatic aunt. His ex-wife posted some cliché inspirational quote tagged with blessed. Meanwhile, his brother-in-law shared an adorable video of his twin daughters splashing around in the sprinkler. Noticing the date on the video, he realized it was taken just 2 days ago. If it was warm enough for swimsuits in January, he worried about what summer might bring. Maybe it was time to invest in a more powerful air conditioner. The baker then switched to a news website and took a big bite of the crumbly cranberry scone. As crumbs fell onto his belly, he clicked on a particularly sensational headline: Argentinian zombies kill millions. The term zombies was a bit exaggerated, and while the afflicted individuals were indeed Argentinian citizens, the disease didn't even originate from Argentina. They were merely unfortunate victims. The baker couldn't help but think how the media had misled the public. A group of scientists in Antarctica had stumbled upon a new type of extremophilic algae that caused chaos in human brains. The article stated that those who came into contact with the algae suffered from severe high blood pressure, fevers, confusion, rage, and if not addressed, resorted to violent behavior. It went on to explain that a plane carrying a sample of this Antarctic algae had landed in Argentina in mid-January, and the baker speculated that it must have escaped somehow. He wasn't too concerned, though. Argentina felt like a world away, and he questioned the reliability of the news report. With that thought, he devoured the scone in one swift bite. As the starry black sky transitioned to the soft indigo of dawn, the baker began his routine of filling the display cases. Baguettes, croissants, danishes, and pastries were meticulously arranged to tempt customers. The baskets of scones were overflowing. A tapping sound interrupted him. The baker glanced up to see an elderly gentleman knocking on the glass door with his umbrella. He recognized the man as a regular patron, who often entertained him with amusing anecdotes from his travels around the globe. Regardless of the weather, he always carried that umbrella, which had become his signature accessory. The man would often emphasize particularly exciting stories with a playful jab of the umbrella handle. He had grown to be one of the baker's favorite customers, and the baker knew he was eager for the freshest morning glory scone. The baker pointed at the closed sign hanging on the door and shrugged apologetically. He prided himself on being punctual and would open the doors precisely at 6. The elderly man squinted, his cheeks flushed with irritation. He struck the glass with his umbrella more forcefully. The baker shook his head vigorously and silently mouthed the word "closed." He gestured towards an imaginary watch and held up 6 fingers to convey his point. In response, the elderly man erupted in frustration, pounding his fists against the glass. "Scones!" he shouted, spraying saliva onto the door. He threw himself against the entrance and slapped his palms against the brick wall. "Scones!" He continued to pound until his hands looked as if they had been tenderized. Beneath his fear, the baker felt a slight surge of pride that his creations could evoke such strong emotions. He clumsily handled his cell phone until he managed to steady his hands and call for help. "Hey there, friend," a youthful voice chimed in. The baker couldn't make out who was approaching down the street, but he noticed a group of dogs straining against their leashes, barking wildly. "Do you need a doctor, friend?" Moments later, the dog walker appeared, making her way towards him. She was petite yet athletic, dressed in a purple NYU hoodie. Her expression was calm and compassionate, though she tightened the dog's leashes. The elderly man turned his wide eyes toward the young woman, exposing his teeth in a grimace. Even from the back of the bakery, the swollen blood vessels on his bright red face were visible. He spat at her and waved his umbrella menacingly. The dog walker's demeanor shifted. She reached into her back pocket. The baker spotted a spiky-haired paperboy pedaling down the steep street. He wore the same frantic, flushed expression as the man demanding scones. Upon noticing the commotion, the boy accelerated and directed his bicycle straight toward them, yelling at the top of his lungs. The baker stood frozen behind the display case, dropping his phone as a tinny voice asked, "911, what's your emergency?" The bicycle collided with the tangled mess of dog leashes, causing chaos. The startled dogs yelped, and their owner lost grip of the leads. They bolted down the street in panic, still connected to one another. The boy tumbled off his bike, sending newspapers flying everywhere. He quickly sprang up and revealed a switchblade, screaming as he swung it at both the man and the student. In response, the man jabbed at the paperboy with his umbrella, while the student unleashed a can of mace. The scuffle moved further down the street, away from the bakery, but the baker could still hear the ruckus through the glass. Screams, shuffling, shrieks, slashes, and then silence. The baker remained frozen and dizzy. Suddenly recalling his purpose, he picked up his cell phone from the ground and spoke to the attentive emergency operator. Just as he began to describe the chaotic scene, the sound of shattering glass sent him crashing to the floor. A throng of furious individuals unleashed their rage, launching stones through the large glass window. The crowd howled and clashed with one another, showing as much fervor in their attacks as they did towards the baker, who was barely concealed inside. Some wielded weapons while others improvised with whatever they could find. One person violently shoved another's head into the bakery display case, causing bread and pastries to scatter across the slick red floor. Sunlight began to filter through the jagged opening where the window once stood, revealing that Argentina didn't seem so distant after all. The baker crawled on his hands and knees toward the closet filled with cleaning supplies. He forcefully kicked the door shut behind him, plunging himself into complete darkness. Pushing aside brooms and mops, he felt the chaotic mob outside getting nearer. The sounds of their spitting, shouting, smashing, and slashing echoed in his ears. He searched along the floorboards, up the walls, and behind the paneling. Was it still there after all these years? He had hidden it away from his ex-wife and then completely forgotten about it. His flour-dusted hands finally brushed against something metallic. As he explored the object with his fingers, memories flooded back, and he grappled with the reality of it. Could it really be true? Wasn't this entire situation just a sensational fabrication by the media? A ruse? Suddenly, the chaos crashed against the supply closet door. Nails scraped and boots thudded against it. Taking a deep breath, the baker rose in the dark, cracked the door open slightly, and aimed the shotgun. The media had been relentlessly reporting on the murders for the last year and a half, and Diane was growing weary of it. Although she felt deep sympathy for the young women who had suffered, she believed they held some responsibility for their own outcomes. As a devout Christian, she thought that living a God-centered life was crucial for navigating a world devoid of faith. She firmly believed that her Christian principles were what safeguarded her and her family. With her daughter away at college, she felt a twinge of fear. Her daughter was an exceptional student who dedicated herself to her studies, and Diane, hoped she would never find herself in danger from a madman. Hearing about the activities of the girls before their tragic ends gave her a twisted sense of comfort. As long as she could steer her daughter clear of that lifestyle, everything would be all right. In every other aspect, her daughter resembled those unfortunate girls. It seems that all the victims had been out enjoying themselves, drinking, and likely engaging in intimate activities. She felt that their choices had contributed to their victimization, making them somewhat accountable for their own tragic fates. If they had chosen to stay home, focusing on their studies and leading more virtuous lives, they might still be alive today. Nevertheless, despite her opinions, the brutal manner of their deaths horrified her, and she despised hearing the news reports detailing the condition of the victims. Changing the channel, she stumbled upon yet another sensational news segment covering a recent gruesome murder. This marked the 10th homicide within an 18-month period. 20-year-old Gia Moriarty was discovered behind a dumpster at a frat house in Austin. This case fueled speculation among newscasters about the possibility of a serial killer on the loose. Initially skeptical, Diane began to see the logic in the theory. All the women shared similar characteristics: Caucasian with brown or black hair and in their early 20s. There were no signs of sexual assault, but it appeared they had been cauterized with a hot metal object before death. Their bodies were left posed with both breasts removed and a cross carved into their chests. The thought sent chills down her spine, and she recognized how harsh her perspective was. Because of this realization, she never brought it up with Frank. She flipped the channel once more, landing on an episode of My 600lb Life, one of her guilty pleasures. She enjoyed observing the lives of others, but deep down, she often found herself judging their physical struggles, even though she herself was 80 pounds over the recommended weight for her small stature. However, she took comfort in the fact that, comparatively, she was still healthy. "You're watching that news story, honey," Frank said from his recliner to her right. His quiet presence had made her forget he was there. "Oh, sorry, Frank. I don't want to hear about those girls being killed by some psychopath. Some of them remind me of Becca." He sat up faster than she anticipated, though his voice remained gentle and measured. "Now, how do you know he's crazy? Looks like he's ridding the world of dirty whores." His matter-of-fact tone sent a shiver down Diane's spine. "Frank," she shouted, secretly agreeing with him but too much of a devout Christian to openly confess it. "What is it, Diane? You know you're thinking the same thing," he retorted, his slow southern accent thickening his words. She glanced at her husband, whose round, ruddy face was framed by a rough beard dusted with white and wild strands of hair, sprouting from his ears. The top of his head shone under the bright light, a testament to his ongoing struggle with weight. Once, he had been a strikingly athletic man who worked hard to provide for her and their children. Although he had let himself go over the years, Diane still found him attractive in that classic dad sort of way. Since Rebecca left for school, however, he had started taking better care of himself and had become more affectionate. He seemed happier lately, so she decided not to rock the boat too much. Well, I suppose if they weren't drinking and using drugs, they might have made safer choices on and off campus, like our little Becca does. She beamed at him, and he returned her smile. "I knew you'd get it," he said earnestly. She smiled again, unsure of what exactly she had understood, but she cherished moments when Frank agreed with her and was in a good mood, so she accepted the compliment. She switched the TV back to the news channel, which was just finishing up. A report about a dismembered body. She glanced at Frank, who was fixated on the screen with the same intensity he once directed at her during their youth. His eager gaze used to envelop her, caressing her curves long before they ever touched. Now he was watching the news with that same hunger, as the anchor described women who had been brutally mutilated. She stared for a moment, and sensing her gaze, Frank shifted uncomfortably, adjusting himself. He attempted to lighten the mood, saying, "Well, these girls ought to stick to the good book instead of being reckless out there in college. Have you talked to Becca about this?" Diane fully embraced the change, deciding she wouldn't be attending those wild frat parties anymore. She confidently told her mom, "Mom, you know I'm here for my education, not for any nonsense," just like she had taught her daughter. In that moment, Diane felt like a proud peacock of a mother. "Yes, we did well, Diane. But I sure miss Becca," Frank said as he stood up. "Where are you headed, Frank?" Diane was enjoying their chat. "I'm going to hang out in the basement for a bit before heading to work," he replied. "What have you been doing down there for so long lately?" Diane asked, curiously. "Oh, nothing much, just maybe working on something for you. But it's not ready for you to see yet," he teased with a wink. Diane felt a blush creeping up on her cheeks, something she hadn't experienced in nearly 15 years, 20 if you counted Frank. Years ago, there was a rough patch in their marriage that brought Diane close to another man, who made her blush and feel alive again. Thankfully, through divine intervention, their marriage survived. "I love it, Frank," she said warmly. Frank walked over to Diane and gently kissed her slightly wrinkled forehead. "Love you," he whispered softly. "I love you too, Frank," she replied, holding his hand for a brief moment. As Frank left the living room and headed toward the kitchen and stairs, Diane switched the TV back to My 600-Pound Life. She could hear Frank moving things around downstairs, but she turned up the volume instead. After about 20 minutes, Frank came back up from the basement. "Off to work, hun. Love ya," he called out, slamming the screen door shut before Diane could respond. She lingered for a few moments, straining to hear Frank's car fade away into the distance. Once she was content with the sound of the engine growing faint, she sprang up on her small, chubby feet. Impatience was her nature, as shown by her reluctance to wait for dessert until after finishing her meal. Waiting for anything was a challenge for her, and Frank was well aware of this trait. She believed that his acknowledgement of a possible surprise would only fuel her determination to search the basement. As she approached the door, she noticed it was secured with a padlock. No problem, though. She knew exactly where Frank stashed all his spare keys. Frank was fully aware that she had this knowledge, which only reinforced her conviction that he wanted her to discover what lay in the basement. She made her way to the front door and lifted a loose floorboard. Reaching into the dark cavity, she retrieved a hefty janitorial keychain. Standing upright, she sifted through the keys as she headed toward the basement door. Among them, she spotted several keys that appeared capable of unlocking the smaller bronze padlock. She attempted the first two, but was met with failure. For some reason, she then opted for the fifth key, perhaps because its shade of bronze seemed most similar. To her delight, the key turned, and the steel mechanism clicked open. The lock was finally released. Basements were uncommon in the southern regions for various reasons, ranging from environmental conditions to practical needs. Factors like temperature, the depth of ground freezing, and even the type of soil played a role. Nevertheless, Frank had chosen to invest extra money into having a basement built when they constructed their home about 15 years ago, shortly after Diane's affair. He explained to her that it symbolized a new beginning for them. Frank was meticulous about the location, ensuring that the soil could support a basement. He often claimed it was primarily for storage, something that many Texans would find hard to comprehend. Diane rarely questioned his reasoning. In fact, she usually backed him up and had little to argue about since he had forgiven her transgressions. Thank goodness. As Diane unlocked the door, she placed the key on the counter to her right. Upon opening the door, she was immediately overwhelmed by the musty odor of mildew, formaldehyde, and a faint scent reminiscent of a perfume, likely named something like Love Spell or Sugary Kisses. For a brief moment, she wondered if Frank had surprised her with a new fragrance. Although she wasn't particularly fond of those youthful scents, she appreciated the gesture, especially since Frank had been increasingly considerate lately. She made her way down the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The unpleasant smell grew stronger as she entered the dimly lit basement. To her right, she spotted an old surgical table that she didn't recall ever owning, marred by a dark brownish stain dripping from its edges. In one corner lay some of Frank's old tools, with his industrial blowtorch resting next to iron fireplace rods that bore charred remnants of animal flesh. Similar brown stains marked a path across the cold cement floor, leading deeper into the shadows. Diane ventured toward the darkness, squinting to discern what lurked in the back left corner of the damp basement. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed the outline of jars lined up on shelves. It was evident that the jars contained a dark liquid, and she could see two gelatinous orbs floating within, though their details remained unclear. Searching for a light cord hanging from the ceiling, she recalled there was one situated in the center of the basement. She turned to her right and headed toward the center, pulling the cord with a firm yank. A bare, dangling light fixture swayed awkwardly in the basement, casting erratic shadows all around. The sudden brightness stung her eyes, prompting her to squint and glance to her left, where she noticed a jar in the corner. The liquid inside was blue, and the orbs were… No, it couldn't be. She rubbed her eyes vigorously, seeing stars when she reopened them. Stepping closer, she grabbed the first jar with trembling hands, her heart racing at the sight of floating chunks of flesh that appeared to have been forcibly taken from women's bodies. There had to be nearly 50 jars, each containing similarly sized and shaped breasts. No, even more. She didn't hear the truck creeping down the long gravel road towards the house or the squeaky brakes as it came to a stop just outside her window. Diane stumbled back, gasping for breath. Her mind was reeling, and her heart pounded loudly in her chest. She turned to flee but froze when something caught her eye in the opposite corner. She cautiously approached the far right side, the light still swinging gently, teasing her with glimpses of what lay ahead before plunging it into darkness. Reaching up, she grasped the light with her trembling right hand, creating a loud clatter as it struck against her rings. Directing the beam toward the far corner, she discovered a young woman lying naked on the floor. The girl's body was bruised and battered, shivering as if on the brink of death, with her nose and eyes tightly bound in thick cloth. She couldn't have been much older than Rebecca. Diane instinctively covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a moment she thought the girl was lifeless, but then the body convulsed like a fish gasping for air. Squinting through her tears, Diane noticed the girl's lips were sealed shut with adhesive and stitches. A wave of nausea washed over Diane, bile rising in her throat. She forced it down with a harsh gulp, her face twisting in horror. Diane was oblivious to the front door opening or the sound of footsteps echoing in the kitchen. The intense ringing in her ears masked the noise of the basement door creaking open, and the heavy thuds of someone descending the stairs. Amidst the nausea rising in her throat, she couldn't hear the boots slapping against the worn concrete floor. Turning around in desperation, she was met with the sight of Frank, who stood before her wielding a club in his right hand. His eyes were the darkest she had ever encountered, and the vein running from his brow to his temple pulsed violently, like a fire hose at full blast. He was panting heavily through his nose, and Diane felt her heart drop into her stomach, felt as if her insides might spill out at any moment. She swallowed hard, attempting to scream, but fear rendered her mute. Taking a shaky step back, she stumbled and fell to the ground, landing on her elbow with a painful crack. A cry of agony escaped her lips, yet she couldn't tear her gaze away from Frank, who was advancing slowly and deliberately. He leaned over, gripping her blouse roughly, and she heard a small rip as he pulled her closer. Their eyes locked, filled with mutual rage and hatred. In that moment, Diane felt as though she were staring into the face of the devil, his once handsome features now twisted into something monstrous. Leaning in so close that their noses nearly touched, he growled in a low, menacing voice, "Can you keep a secret?" It was a tragic car accident that took their lives. My aunt and grandfather. She was taking him back to the nursing home where my grandmother awaited them. I wasn't particularly close to either of them. We only communicate with my mother's side of the family during funerals or on certain holidays. "Charlotte, you need to head to the farm and tidy up the house for sale," my mom instructs me over the phone. "Mom, please, Charlotte, I can't go back there." She rarely asks for favors, making it hard for me to decline this one. "The estate lawyer will meet with you and handle everything. Thank you, Charlotte." With that, she hangs up. I try calling my brother but end up leaving a voicemail since he never picks up when I call. Then again, I'm not much better at answering his calls. You might say our family is quite dysfunctional, and I think that's a fair assessment. My mom seldom discusses her childhood. My aunt was always anxious and easily frightened. My mom has a different type of anxiety. She's perpetually looking over her shoulder. But she and her sister were never close. Now they'll never have the chance to reconcile because my aunt is gone. It still feels strange to say or even contemplate. She's really gone. What troubles me most is that at the spot where the car veered off the road, there weren't any skid marks on the pavement. The Weston farmhouse has been in my mother's family since the Civil War. It's located in the remote parts of Missouri, where the nearest neighbors are a mile away and corn and pork serve as the local currency. Thankfully, our family never engaged in pig farming. They primarily focused on corn. As I drive up the gravel driveway, an overwhelming sense of dread washes over me. The last time I was here, I was 7 and my brother was 9. Mom had been crying the night before our departure, but Dad insisted we had to go. So, we all squeezed into the car and endured an 8-hour drive to the farmhouse, during which Mom didn't utter a word. When we arrived, my aunt was already there, 3 glasses of vodka in, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide and unblinking. My grandparents sat silently in the living room, motionless. My brother and I dashed through the fields, eager to escape the foul odor of our house. That's when I stumbled upon a tiny golden locket resting in an untouched patch of dirt near the property line. Excitedly, I picked it up and waved it in front of my brother's face before sprinting back home to flaunt my newfound treasure. I handed it over to my mom, who looked like she might faint at the sight of the tarnished necklace in my hand. However, when my grandfather caught sight of it, he snatched it away from me, gripped my shoulders tightly, and shook me while growling, "You little brats shouldn't be rummaging through my stuff." Mom intervened, pushing him away from me. But then, he struck her. My aunt gasped and dropped her glass in shock. We quickly got back into the car and headed home. That was the final time I set foot on the Weston farm. Now I lock my car door and approach the dilapidated front entrance. The screen door creaks ominously as I pull it open and step inside the dim, deserted house. The air is thick with the scent of dust and rust. All the leftover furniture is draped in sheets, and the windows are boarded up tight. On the dining room table lies a card with the lawyer's name, and a note instructing me to call her upon my arrival. Since there's no cell service out here, I'll have to use the rotary phone hanging in the kitchen. "Hi, Alyssa. This is Charlotte Nash, Thomas Weston's granddaughter, who just passed away." "Hi, Charlotte. I spoke with your mom, Eloise. I'm so sorry for your loss. How are you holding up?" I can't help but think how surprising it is that anyone would feel sorrow over Thomas Weston's death. I know my mom certainly doesn't. I informed the lawyer that we won't be keeping any belongings from the house and plan to sell everything. After we hang up, she tells me she'll come by in 2 days and suggests I take some time to look through the house and assess its contents. I take a moment to survey my surroundings. The kitchen hasn't likely been used in months. I manage to whip up a small dinner, which I eat alone on the back porch. As the sun sets over the cornfields, it casts a warm glow on the old house, almost, making me wish I had spent more time here. Almost. My uncle passed away when I was just 9 years old. He and my aunt had been frequently visiting the Weston farm. It happened unexpectedly. He tumbled down the stairs into the basement while my aunt and grandfather were out shopping for groceries. When they returned to the farm, they discovered his lifeless body on the cold cement floor of the unfinished basement, surrounded by a pool of blood, while my grandmother remained upstairs in bed. My mother chose not to attend the funeral, which I believe marked the beginning of a significant divide between her and my aunt. My brother and I stood beside his casket as he was laid to rest in a nearby cemetery. We left immediately after the burial, with my father holding on to our hands the entire time. That night, I stayed up until 2 in the morning, rummaging through the house and checking prices online to see how much we could sell the mahogany dining set, coffee tables, and the old couch for. By the time I was ready to sleep, Nearly everything on the first floor had a sticky note attached to it. As soon as the sun came up, I was already awake and feeling drained. Naturally, there was no coffee in the house, so I decided to take a drive around town in search of a coffee shop. However, finding a proper coffee shop seemed too ambitious for this area, so I had to settle for coffee from a gas station. "Rough night?" the girl at the register asked as I handed her my credit card. I suppressed a laugh and replied, "You could say that." "I need to see your ID to verify the credit card," she informed me. "It's store policy, sorry. I know it's strange." All I could do was shrug as I handed her my license. Her eyes widened when she glanced at it. "You're related to Thomas and Marion Weston?" she exclaimed. I stared at her in disbelief. She couldn't be older than 20, and here I was, 5 years her senior. How did she know about me? About my family? Yeah, I'm their granddaughter. But we weren't very close, I replied, noticing her lips pressed together tightly. "I don't want to intrude, but are the rumors true?" she whispered as if sharing a secret. "What rumors?" I asked, matching her tone. "About the girls?" she responded, handing me my coffee. "I'm not sure what you mean, sorry," I said, trying to maintain my composure. She offered a sad smile. "There are just town rumors about your grandparents and, you know, all the males in your family." A wave of anger washed over me. "Little troublemakers, can I please have my card back?" I ask, more assertively than politely. The girl gives me a nod. "Sure, here you go." She hands it over, and before she can pose any more oddly specific questions, I hurry out of the gas station and make my way back to my car. Once there, I park in the farmhouse driveway and let the tears flow for about 10 minutes until I gather enough strength to head inside. This house doesn't allow for tears. My father passed away 11 years ago when I was just 14. At that time, our grandmother had recently moved into a nursing home. My grandfather wouldn't join her for another 3 years. Mom refused to visit her and insisted that no one in our family would be making that trip. They had many arguments about it, and eventually Dad went by himself. He once said, "When it's our turn to be in a nursing home, I hope our children can set aside their grievances to come see us." He died in a car crash on his way home after falling asleep at the wheel. He had a significant amount of sleeping medication in his system. My grandfather tried to persuade Mom to lay him to rest alongside the other Westons, but she never returned those calls. No one from her side attended the funeral. There was simply no room for Westons at that service. I discovered an old, shiny key tucked away in my grandmother's nightstand, a little enigma. I found a key that doesn't seem to fit anywhere in the house. Perhaps it belongs to a safe deposit box. "Could you please call me back at the landline? My cell isn't working here." I left as a message on my mom's voicemail. It took a few hours for her to respond, telling me there wasn't a safe deposit box belonging to anyone in our family. I kept sorting through everything upstairs and set aside a good number of my grandmother's clothes to take to the nursing home. I removed all the photos from their frames and unplugged every lamp. Every bed was stripped, with sheets and blankets neatly folded. The house was cluttered with notes detailing price ranges for bed frames, dressers, nightstands, and old jewelry. But honestly, we don't care about the selling price. We just want it all gone. The thought of the key lingered in my mind. So, I loaded my grandmother's boxed clothes into the back of the car and, with a careful glance at an old road map, headed toward the nursing home. I trailed behind a woman named Lisa as she guided me down a corridor into a small, sunlit room. There I spotted a woman with a tidy gray braid cascading down her back, seated by a window, gazing at her hand. "Marion, you have a visitor?" Lisa gently pushed me forward and I placed the box of clothes at the foot of the bed before sitting beside it. "Hello. Grandma?" Marion looked up blankly, her gaze seeming to pass right through me. "Eloise," she murmured. "People often remarked that I resembled my mother." "I brought a box of your clothes," I said, pulling out an old sweater and laying it on her lap. She picked it up and ran her fingers over the fabric. "Eloise," Marion repeated, but I simply shook my head. "My mom isn't here, Grandma." "I'm your granddaughter, Charlotte. Do you remember me?" She remained silent, and I had to remind myself not to feel disheartened. Why would she recall me? I couldn't even recognize her, and here I was, 25 with a perfectly sound memory. Taking a deep breath, I retrieved the key from my pocket and extended it for her to see. "I found this key while cleaning your house. Where does it belong?" Then something shifted. Her expression twisted, her hands began to tremble, and she pushed the sweater off her lap. Suddenly, her head jerked up and she focused on me. Really focused. Little brats shouldn't be rummaging through my belongings. But instead of shouting, she reacted differently than her husband. She took a deep breath and brushed my hand away. "They will not be like him. They will never be like him." Then she started muttering names, most of which I couldn't quite catch. Sarah, Casey, Sophie, Lucy, Anna, Olivia, Maria. She began to sway back and forth in her chair, her lips moving quicker, the names fading into whispers. "Marion, where does this key go?" I asked again, raising my voice slightly as if that would help. She met my gaze and her expression softened. "I can't. I just can't. Keep this to yourself. The attic is a safe place." "Eloise." She pauses her movements and gently touches my cheek, assuring me that he will never be like him. Knock, knock. Lisa pops back into the doorway asking, "How's it going?" She quickly rushes to my grandmother, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Marion? Marion? Are you all right?" She calls out, and then shouts something down the hallway. A man walks, in taking over Lisa's position as she turns to me and says, "Sorry, Charlotte, but you should probably leave." I don't need to be told twice. "Is she always like this?" I ask Lisa, who nods with a serious expression. "Actually, she's improved a bit since your grandfather passed away." "Can I ask why my grandfather was out of the home?" I inquire. But Lisa suddenly goes quiet, her face losing color. "You can talk to our lawyer if you want," she replies tersely, and I try to hide my surprise at her abrupt change in demeanor. "No, that's not necessary. Did he leave on his own, or did my aunt take him out for the day?" Lisa looks very uneasy. "I really shouldn't. Please." She exhales deeply. "Your aunt checked him out. We advised against it, but she insisted. She claimed there was some old family matter he needed to handle. They were on their way back when they got into the accident. I'm truly sorry." "Thank you. My aunt had a son who died when he was very young. They were at Weston Farms and he suffocated in his sleep. They called it SIDS. I was 4 years old. After that, we never spent another night at my grandparents' house. The house appears just as unwelcoming this afternoon as it did yesterday. The attic is a safe place, that's what she said. But there's no attic here." I make my way upstairs to the second floor, checking each room as I go, scanning the ceilings for a pull-down ladder. It isn't until I reach my grandparents' closet that I finally find what I'm searching for. I drag an old chair over and hook my finger around a small loop, causing a ladder to crash down, almost knocking me off balance. My heart sinks. There is an attic. I grab my phone, turn on the flashlight, and begin climbing the creaky rungs of the ladder. As soon as my head breaks through into the dim space, I'm hit with a strong scent of bleach. I have to take a moment to steady myself and quell the throbbing in my skull. A thin metal cord brushes against my cheek, and I tug on it to switch on the lone light bulb that brightens the area. There are no windows, and the space is incredibly tight, forcing me to tilt my head to avoid bumping into the ceiling. On the floor, I spot 3 boxes, and the dust reveals old footprints, indicating someone has been here within the past year. I drag one of the boxes closer and lift the lid. Inside, I find only clothes that seem like they might have belonged to my mother or aunt, judging by their style. The jeans are from brands I've never encountered before, and all the shirts are cropped. However, at the bottom of the box lies an old metal chain with a cuff attached, stained with something that looks alarmingly like blood. I have to fight back the bile rising in my throat. The second box holds a pair of rusty pliers resting on top of yellowed newspapers from the town. They recount stories of missing girls: Sarah, Casey, Sophie, Lucy, Anna, Olivia, Maria. The third Box contains a small safe with a keyhole designed to secure its contents. My heart races as I retrieve the tiny key from my pocket. When my brother was 6, he lost his first tooth. Blood dripped down his chin as he excitedly rushed to show our mom, placing the tooth in her open hand. She dropped it and screamed. My father had to leave work after my frantic brother called him. Mom locked herself in her room for 3 days afterward. We were told the tooth fairy doesn't visit our house, and if we lost a tooth, we should just toss it out and inform Dad later. With a twist of the old key, the small metal safe clicks open. My heart freezes and a chill washes over me. Inside are hundreds of teeth clattering together as my trembling hand drops the box to the floor. The attic is safe. Oh my God, is all I can think. Waves of nausea crash over me. Attic, bleach, chains, clothing, the old locket, newspapers, pliers, teeth, all those teeth. I feel like I'm about to faint as everything suddenly clicks into place. My mother and aunt lived in constant fear of their father, the man who would bring girls home only for their faces to appear in the newspaper a week later, the man who kept jewelry around the house that he never purchased, the man who took the lives of all those girls. A small velvet jewelry pouch tumbled out and landed next to me. I carefully opened it, and 3 items spilled into my hand. 2 wedding rings and a tiny baby rattle. They will not turn out like him. They will never be like him. One of the wedding bands looks eerily similar to my mom's. As I rotate it in my hand, I search for the engraving, the words I used to read repeatedly on my father's ring. To my husband, love Eloise Eloise. He will never be like him. My father, my uncle, my baby cousin, they will never become like him. They will never resemble Thomas Weston. Marion ensured they would never have that opportunity.